programming languages. You love them, you hate them, you just can't justify a Silicon Valley salary without them. And we love talking about them. I'm Jas here. This is Mike. This is a podcast series where we talk about programming languages and what's next.
What's our topic for today, Jas?
So one of the things about programming languages is the quality of the programs you write in them. And one of the tools that we use to make that be awesome is code review. So I thought we'd talk about code review. What do you think?
That sounds like a great topic. So are there any things that make code review easier in some languages and harder in others? Do you dislike
good one to start
reviewing
with, right?
code in any particular language?
So I think you've instantly hit on like at least two of the things that I often think about when I'm reviewing somebody's code, rather than thinking about the code itself. I've spent a large portion of my career life reviewing code that you've written, actually.
I'm so sorry.
But so there's at least two aspects, right? There's how easy is it to review code written in a particular programming language, and then how easy does the environment make it to review the code. Let's do the programming language one first, because I think that most of our listeners wouldn't think that has anything to do with code review.
Yeah, so I think ignoring, obfuscated C contest and malbolg and brainfuck and things that are intentionally hard to review. I think a code reviewer is partly there to compensate for the weaknesses in the coder, kind of, your blind spots when it comes to the code you write, the things that because you envision how it's supposed to be, you don't notice when it fails to be that way, right? But I think there's also compensating for the weaknesses in the tools, right? So some languages make it easier to express certain invariants than others, right? So, in Java, like if I create a class and it has a foo method, I know that as long as the compiler runs, there's going to be a foo method there to call. That's not, modulo, null, which is a big modulo.
Right.
Yeah, and so in JavaScript, that's not the case. So JavaScript, I can always combine things, but I can't always rely on things being in a particular combination because I don't get that compiler check. And so I just have different kinds of, and I'm not saying JavaScript is better than, Java or vice versa. It's just, there are different things I pay attention to when reviewing one code in one language than another, right?
So that's an interesting point, right? So essentially, it's not a shortcoming in the tool, it's a shortcoming in the language itself, right? Like there's aspects of the language which make it easy to make a particular kind of mistake. And what you're saying is that, hey, we can rely on this second pair of eyes to make sure that we haven't fallen into a trap that the design of the language has laid out for us.
Yeah, and so with JavaScript, it's very easy to wrap a function and say, here's something that takes the same parameters, and I'll just like do some stuff and then return the result. And notionally, that function has the same type as the wrapped function. But that's kind of somewhat harder to express in maybe a more static language, right? The idea that, this function takes whatever the other one does, delegates it to the other function, and then returns it, kind of if you've got 3 parameters instead of 4, or you've got optional parameters, that's in a static language, you've got to do, a lot of work to kind of wrap functions in a compatible way. In JavaScript, that, so it's easier to write JavaScript to do certain kinds of metaprogramming. But in the more static language, it's easier to read code that is writable
right,
and conclude that it does kind of what you want.
Interesting.
And
So
so,
okay, I can understand that, right? So there's also this notion of certain languages have inadvertently action at a distance happening, right? So like I'm reviewing this particular piece of code, but actually the effect of this piece of code, or actually even worse, some other piece of code somewhere that might not even be part of my code review. Like, most of the code that we review is you review not the entire source code, but you review a diff, right? A change list.
yeah,
And there might be things outside of my change list that affects the semantics of this thing that I'm reviewing. Now,
yeah.
is that something that the choice of programming language affects, or is that something that the framework that you choose or how you choose to author the language has a bigger effect on, you think?
So I guess I think there's a lot in that question,
Right.
and I think you can address that at different
Thank
layers,
you.
like kind of at the syntactic layer, like what's just outside of the chunk that you're encoding that could change the meaning of your encoding. Like in a language like JavaScript, maybe you leave a semicolon off, and just below the fold of in your code review tool, it's like square brackets or something, and so that's
Right.
turned like the initializer in a local variable into an array access that might not have been intended, and so that's at the syntactic level. And just for the audience, I love JavaScript. I bag on it a lot because I know it.
Mike, this is
But
the second time you had to explicitly apologize for bagging on JavaScript.
well, no,
I
I
mean,
mean,
JavaScript's all grown up. I'm sure it can take it.
it's kind of like it's very somebody could easily point out all of the foibles of a person they live with rather than it's kind of in that way. But so at that syntactic level, there's kind of like the code review, if you just looked at one extra line, suddenly you realize, oh, there's a hazard here. But also at the the risks of code review, things happening unexpectedly. And if you're using a pure functional language, the pure functional languages, people are like, well, if you just used a pure functional language like civilized people, none of this would happen. Yeah, and I mean that's true to some level.
But to be fair, the problem that you're pointing out is a syntactic problem, right? Like, so
well, so
even
sorry that
one can conceive of a pure functional language that still has the misfeature that characters added later change the semantics of
yeah.
of a construct that appeared earlier.
Well, I was actually trying to put a fork in the syntactic stuff and move
Oh, I see.
to a discussion of like, mutable state.
Right.
Like if you're dealing in a pure functional language, you don't have as many semantic hazards, right? Where two things can change, and a code reviewer or a code author, assumes, all right, I'm using X here, I do some stuff, and then I use X, and those X's are functionally equivalent despite what's in the middle. So can the reviewer ignore the middle when kind of like looking at two chunks that refer to the same thing by name? Is a name always the name to something equivalent, or is like this name at time 0 and this at name at time 1? So those kinds of invariants, like if you're working in an imperative language, you need to pay very careful attention to that kind of stuff.
Actually, just going, like, digging into that point just a little bit more. So even languages that are much weaker in their guarantees than functional languages are able to make. So actually, let me reverse that. There are languages for which that may not be the case in ways that are very strange to programmers, right? So in C, you may define a function. There's a block of code during which time nothing happens, like no reference to this variable is made, and then you read the variable, and because of multi-threading and because of memory unsafety,
and because of aliasing, yeah.
they still, this value may change.
Yeah,
This is yet another hazard that the code reviewer, I guess, is helping you
yeah.
prevent yourself from making, right?
And I think, some, there's languages that are imperative that have shared mutable state, but yet which set defaults. And so they default to not mutable, which means that there are syntactic guideposts in the code, like syntactic orange safety cones, effectively in the code that help a reviewer. Like, they draw the reviewer sees mute, M-U-T, in Rust, and they know, oh, I need to pay more attention to this than a variable that doesn't have mute. And in OCaml, if you see ref cells, again, like, OCaml, you tend to pass around records. By default, those records are immutable after construction, and so, but if you see a ref type,
Right.
oh
You're
yeah,
like,
like that's gonna, something weird could happen there. Whereas, with let in or var in JavaScript, that's not the case. And
so far we've relegated the job of the code reviewer to just being a mental human linter, right? Like there's
yeah,
like there's a bigger role that the code reviewer plays, though.
yeah, I guess, I mean, with a code review, if so, code review done well, you involve, it's a conversation among peers that starts early in the design process and seeks feedback at multiple steps, but that's a lot of work.
Right.
And there are, power dynamics. It's not always a review between peers. Like, if you were ever an intern and your intern host was like, hey, here's a code review. Or if you started at Google and some guy like Mike is like, hey, new guy, here's like 30,000 lines of code. Can you check that for me by tomorrow?
Right. Right.
And there's it we don't always get the luxury to give feedback early enough to catch kind of the worst kinds of problems. And so, yonks ago, I was, some PM asked me to do a code review for a new person, and it was just and it was in Java. Very nice lady who, obviously had this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the Java libraries. And she'd written some code, and I was looking at it, and she's older than me, kind of farther along in her career, but I was, I was asked, I volunteered basically to pick up some slack because that team was having troubles at the time, and help her on board. And I looked at the code and I'm like, I couldn't see anything wrong with it. Her test suite was very good. She obviously had an encyclopedic knowledge of the standard libraries. She was doing things with reflection, Java reflection, that made it very hard for me to actually, and so, I kind of hinted at, like this user reflection is making me a little uncomfortable. I like your test cases. I'm trying to stay positive because, she's just joined the company. I want it to be a positive experience. She kind of like, oh yeah, I'll change, and she made some cosmetic changes and then committed it. And I did not at the time have the, confidence to go, no, we need to roll this back because this has structural problems. And, I could have handled that better. I could have said, this is making it hard to review, so let's focus a lot of effort on the test case, or let's get a second opinion. But, sometimes you're limited by kind of social factors and time constraints on what you can do.
That's an interesting point, right? Like I've certainly been on both sides of situations not dissimilar to the one that you described, where
sorry for that.
Where there's a disparity between either the experience, perceived or real, between the author of code and the reviewer of code. Like, I mean, I eventually, certainly when I don't understand code, my initial assumption is not that the code is written badly, although maybe, if you are isomorphic to many members on your teams, like if you are similar to other people on your team, then you should assume that if you don't understand, then maybe they won't understand either.
Yeah, or they won't understand it like a week from now, or the maintainer
right,
won't understand
or
it.
even the author wouldn't. Exactly,
Yeah.
right. And so you're playing the role of some future version of this person. But this social dynamic that you describe is also one that is very open to abuse. Sorry, like you can end up in a situation where the code reviewer, by orchestrating, like by puppeteering the author, is actually writing the code, right? Like, no, like do this, like no, do this, right? Like, and that also is unfortunate. That also fails the purpose that code review has, which is, actually that's a good question, right? We never answered the question. What is the purpose of code review? So one of the purposes that we've noticed is to make sure that the author does not fall into the pitfalls that the language provides.
And I think we should make our audience aware that we have a sec-eng bias, a security engineering bias. And so, we tend to write things, we tend to assume when we're reviewing that, inputs come from untrusted sources unless we know that ahead of time. And so, I mean, sometimes when you're reviewing application code, you're like, does this feature do what it what it's supposed to? Does it provide a good user experience? None of that is assuming that like there's like an attacker kind of just out of view trying to send you dodgy inputs and crafted strings and and so I think code review done badly can be an adversarial behavior, an adversarial interaction. But where the reviewer is trying to prove they're better than the reviewee, which is definitely kind of toxic. But with a sec-eng bias, you explicitly try to adopt the if I'm putting myself in the mindset of somebody who's going to attack your code, but like that doesn't mean you can't do it in a collegial way, right? But yeah, sometimes you're reviewing for kind of do we have the same understanding of the problem? What is the fit of the solution for the problem? And are you employing your tools well to actually embody that solution in something that can run, right? And are you giving enough to future team members, maintainers? Sometimes code review is more about knowledge sharing than and shared ownership. And it is actually
in order to make sure that everybody on the team or more people on the team understand the nuances of this particular area of code.
And I mean, just to lead. I mean, in a well-functioning team, there's cross-cutting concerns like logging, right? For example, and so if in a well-functioning team, you would hope that over time team members would a consensus would emerge on how to do these cross-cutting things similarly, right? Everybody kind of does logging the same way. You don't end up with a lot of incompatible one-offs, right? And so knowledge sharing is one of the ways you do that. I'm saying, oh yeah, like I see how you're doing logging. Maybe that will influence the way I do logging in my module. And you use this trick to deal with like a thorny race condition. When I'm writing code which is also concurrent and maybe is interleaving operations with yours, because we're using, we'll probably have less bugs if we kind of do concurrency in the same way, right?
I see.
Kind of,
and the opposite too, right? Like the code reviewer. So code review has the knowledge transfer from the author to the reviewer, as well as from the reviewer back to the author, right? Like I think that showing rather than telling aspect of code review is sometimes not something that
Yeah.
it's certainly a nuance that I wouldn't, it would not have occurred to me.
Yeah, have you learned anything about a language or a tool chain or a framework from like a code review that, you know, maybe somebody from somebody junior to you, kind of on the
Absolutely.
ladder?
One of the tricks that I definitely remember again from JavaScript was, JavaScript has this, I think, misfeature where, this object that you're calling a method on is implicitly passed into a message, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes you want that. And in fact, most of the time you want that. But occasionally you don't. And I think that the way that I learned that this was something that you wouldn't want to do is seeing. I think it was one of our former coworkers at Google who would always end up calling these functions by doing the one comma the object trick in order to, like, not pass this particular object in. And it was odd.
And so you have like an object named O, and there's a function in a field of that object. And instead of doing O dot, let's call it F. Instead of
right.
O dot F of arguments, you changed the O, so you parenthesize the O dot F part, and put a comma expression in there, so the call is taking the syntactic path where it's not a method call, it's a fetch of a field and then a call of that value.
Exactly. And what was interesting to me was the discussion that created. I was the code reviewer at that point, and I was like, I don't understand, why are you doing this, this seemingly no op operation that is making your code look uglier. And we went through this entire thing. We ended up refactoring the code so that you would assign a temporary variable, O.F.
To make it clear.
And then you would just call it. And the punchline to this story is, I believe at that point, JavaScript was compiled by what at Google was called JS compiler, but the rest of the world now knows it as Clojure compiler. And Clojure compiler would see this separation and then be like, "Oh, don't worry, I got it." And
it's like, oh, I could just turn this into
yeah, exactly, and
just
be like,
pesimize.
No, O.F, like, don't worry, I'll save you some
time. Optimize all of our security paranoidness.
Right. Actually, that might be a good way to transition to tooling. So we've talked about programming languages and how humans are helping. Like, what role does the code review tool play in making things easier?
So I think there's avoiding, like, I guess my inclination is always to talk about security guarantees, but because of the sec-eng bias. But even in a even outside of that area, people have written papers about, are there any programming languages that have, like, what are bug rates in programming languages? Is code written in one language more likely to be less buggy than code written in another language? And the answer is, usually in the noise.
Oh, is that right?
It's
my bias is very much aligned with, there are some languages that make it easier to write buggy code.
I think that the last large study, there was a bit of a kerfuffle about is the signal as strong? And I think there were some charges of kind of methodological problems that may have been over, but I didn't really look into it. But there's not a clear consensus that one language is better than the others. But I think from our experiences at Google, it's it's not like the programming language that helps you write less buggy code. I think programmers have coping strategy. Somebody who's writing writing PHP for 10 years, knows how to write PHP that's pretty good. Somebody who's been writing C++ for 20 years is still going to make bugs that crash everything. But, not as much as, like somebody who's only been writing PHP for like, or C++ for 5 years. So,
Like
so the
short
language,
period,
the language matters as far as kind of the effects that the bugs have on like the whole system.
I see.
But I don't know that they affect bug rates that much. But I think one of the things that I think, people are looking at programming languages because those are things that you can actually compare. You can get enough instances of code on GitHub, which is not, really representative of code, and do those analyses. What you can't do is you can't look at, what are the bug rates for code written using Google's tightly integrated tool chain versus a tightly integrated tool chain in Facebook versus a less tightly integrated tool chain in a company that doesn't have the engineering resources that those two have.
Presumably you could, but there'd be a lot of confounding factors that you would need to choose out as well.
And so it's hard to do those it's hard to do those experiments, partly because it's hard to get access to the code. There's probably like, are you going to have enough like, data points to actually, I don't know. But I suspect that it's not, it's not any one tool that like radically reduces bug rates. It is the tight integration of tool chains, so that, for example, I send a PR. That PR gets linters and static analyze pull request. In Google, it's a code review, CL, a change list. So I send out a patch that gets run against test suites, static analyzers run, and what you as the reviewer see is, diffs of files, which are pretty, and they have all the visual color cues that you like. They also have, static analyzer said, static analyzer Bob says, this pattern is kind of dodgy. Maybe look at this article over here, which explains. And so the tool chain itself embodies lessons learned by the engineering organization. And it's always a tough decision. Do we surface things that might be like what's the risk reward of like having people read these all the time, and like, do people start ignoring all of your static analyzer results because one category of them is kind of useless? But they've saved my bacon on occasion. To the point where I go through the code review and look like, before I, like I send the code review out, and then I go through it and try to fix issues before that. Yeah.
I see. So I mean, like, this is a linter, but like what I'm hearing you say is this is not merely a linter. This is a broader set of
there's a whole bunch of automated systems that look at your code, and they're to some degree interactive. So they're not giving like a thumbs up or thumbs down on your code. They actually have they can call the reviewer's attention to things. And so one example is the if this then that tool. Like, sometimes, I've got some code in one language, and like anytime I change that code, I should probably be making a corresponding change in some other place. And so, there's an automated tool that says, there's a way to craft comments so that you can, that relationship lives in the code. And then there's, an automated check, which says, hey, you changed one of these things, but not both of them. Are you really sure?
Right. So we originally talked about relegating the role of the code reviewer to looking out for the common traps, and this is sort of capturing and automating, not authoritatively, but in a nudging kind of a way.
I mean, we can reduce the boring parts of code review.
Right.
to some degree by automation. And so like computer assisted code review is
Right.
going to be
Yeah.
more effective than like unassisted code review, right?
I like that. The other thing that you hinted at was the color coding, the way in which a diff is represented, right? Like I do remember, and this
Yeah.
is horrifying now. I do remember back when I began reviewing diffs as actual diffs, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
actual patches, and those were horrifying, right? Like it's horrifying to me. Like I get goosebumps thinking back to like how was I ever expecting to be able to understand, because a diff is a change to something that is to some set of semantics that already exist, and
Yeah.
modern code review tools do a really good job of contextualizing if there's that trailing semicolon problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see that this is the diff, but you can also see like a little bit later in the lines, maybe dimmed out somehow, that
Yeah.
this is the rest of the context, and those seem critical to making to again helping the code reviewer do a good job understanding
Yeah.
what it is that the author was trying to do.
Like if you're just doing diff, if you're running diff in Google it'd be G4 diff. If you're running diff -C5 because I want
Right.
5 lines of context around every chunk,
Right.
and then you're like, oh, I need one more line, quit out of my pager, G4 diff -C6,
Right. Right.
okay, no, that's, and being able to, yeah, so I mean, being able to see, oh, I've reviewed this file, being able to draft comments, and oh, like 3 lines, three files later, I see the answer, and so I can go back and edit
You can
it.
go
I mean,
back and check.
like, yeah, I mean, when you're doing a code review, what you're doing is you're annotating a document.
Yeah.
and all of the nice Office suite amenities come in useful there.
Right. One of my pet peeves around code review tools is that we still end up treating diffs as changes to a document, but the code review tool provides like local context in lines, but not in other dimensions, right? So for example, sometimes what I want to know is I see a diff and I want to have included in the diff somehow the call sites to this new function that I'm introducing.
Yeah.
Like things like other dimensions, and how one does it is going to be very hard. Like one of the nice things about documents is that they're like naturally linear.
And I think, yeah, so I guess that so we can raise the discussion a level, like,
right.
When I'm in the IDE, I have a level of interactivity with code that I don't when I am just viewing it in like looking at a file view, and I'm losing an awful lot of information and losing investigative tools, and stepping away from languages which are based on files. There are languages out there. This is outside of my area of expertise, but there are languages out there where you might see a file representation in the editor, but
right.
what you're actually editing is some kind of other program representation. And you can imagine, instead of doing code review, if you have if you're collaborating via an interactive editor working on the same representation, maybe you would have more options, and maybe that would lead to a better result. That sounds more like, is there a middle ground between code review and pair programming that is productive?
I think that's actually a very good point, right? I mean, essentially, like
I think it was your point. I don't know.
I mean, it wasn't, but
okay.
But it is a point that I have in the past made, because collaboratively building, when you're building
Yeah.
something as a team, you're not
Yeah.
building a program, right? Like
Yeah.
you're building an application, you're building something that
Yeah.
at least in my mind, I'm able to visualize, like I know what it looks like. And if I had some ability to go over and be like, hey Mike, look at this thing that I have built,
Yeah.
like, and Mike says like, no, like this thing is square shaped, but like it really ought to be like a round shape, right? Like,
Yeah.
whereas what we are forced to do is review a textual description of the thing which, when run, builds this particular object, right?
Yeah.
And I think that your point is extremely sharp, right? Like when you're doing peer coding, when you're doing peer programming, it is almost a continuous code review, right? Because you're
Yeah.
building something collaboratively, and so
Yeah.
you can see, but what you miss out on there, I guess, is the tooling help that you're getting from code
Yeah.
review tools, right?
Yeah, and so one of the things I guess the trend in modern languages has been away from again with Java. You mentioned you have these long type phrases,
Yes.
map of thing of t, comma, list of other thing of x, y equals new
Right.
map of thing of so and towards kind of just enough type inference to lead to more succinct code, not like towards OCaml style type inference where you've got like type inference across modules and
right.
but just enough type inference that like now we've got the auto keyword in some languages and type inference based on the types of initializers for local variables.
So
and that's great. You don't have to write the types, but sometimes you want to see the types. And so one thing, I've been doing some work in Kotlin, which is, for people who don't know, it's kind of, you take some of the lessons that Scala learned from Java and produce something that's a little bit closer to Java, but with a lot of the words removed. So Kotlin's a lovely language if you happen to be working on the JVM. In the IDE, I'll type val x equals, which is how you declare a local variable, and then the initializer. It will take the type phrase. It will actually, the IDE shows me the type after the variable name. Yes. So right. I see val x : type, even though I didn't type that. And that's nice. It lets me, if I'm
like
I use it
in your mind.
Yeah, and I'll often type val x equals something just so I can figure out what kind of type I'm getting. Do I need to adapt it or bridge it to something else? And so having the things that the IDE knows about the program, which is useful when you're writing it, available in the review tool would be nice.
That's a good point. I increasingly feel as we go through this, but building code review tools into the IDE so that you have all of the facility of the IDE available to you as you review code would be very valuable. I'm sure that tools of that sort exist too.
I think code review, if you happen to use an online hosting service, they have code review tools. Continuous integration suites have code reviews, but they tend to be just file based. It would be nice if it would be really nice if as part of the pre like you send a patch up, and usually that goes through like the test suite runs, which means there's some tool doing something with it. It would be nice if the metadata, variable metadata and stuff from that could be reincorporated back into the view, so that what you're getting, because obviously like the tool takes the source text and the diff, does the merge and does enough to give you and pretty prints it. There are, if we could incorporate inferences in there, I think that would be a great. but I think maybe we should talk a little bit about negative experiences with code reviews, because I think a lot of people do have negative
fairly negative
experiences.
experience. I mean,
Yeah,
we talked a little bit about the negative, like sort of social experiences
yeah.
of code review. Did you have something else in mind?
Well, I guess we talked about the point of code review, but we didn't talk about what's not the point of code review.
Oh,
and
that's an excellent
and
point.
and like we talked about collegiality. We're not cops,
Right.
and I think the term gatekeeper, it's easy to overuse that, but I think that it's also important, the point of code review is not, you shouldn't go into it with a mindset of, there is a line that I must hold.
Right.
And
right.
code cannot, I'm here to defend the code base from other people's code. And that's not the right mindset.
Interesting. I mean,
I
like,
think,
how if that is not the right mindset, like, how do you maintain code quality without that mindset? Like, what should the mindset be?
Well, so I guess you and I have probably been around long enough that any place we work, we're probably going to be kind of seen as part of engineering leadership.
Unfortunately for them, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think, and if you've seen an engineering organization kind of grow over time, I think you adopt this view that what is acceptable code, large aspects of that are dependent on the task, right? They're task dependent, right? And there's I mean, there's plenty of like things that you probably don't want to do in any code base, but the kind of what and every team kind of a well-functioning team develops coping strategies, right? So they're going to be lax in some areas so that they can deliver a quality product, kind of a product of a certain quality within a certain time frame. Every you have different biases around like speed versus kind of you want to start off like and you're not imposing the same testing requirements early on that you are late. Right. Once you're iterating fast quickly so that you can kind of build a consensus about this is kind of like broadly how the thing is going to work. And then you want to produce something that is going to be testable, and then like kind of you move over time to a we're more careful with changes, we're more careful about anything that could affect stability. Things have to come with more tests because the broad strokes have been set, and we're refining, right? We're refining towards an acceptable goal.
So that means that even like we've been talking about code review as a sort of static fixed practice, but no, what you're saying is that the things that you look out for, the things that a code reviewer looks out for, change over time because the maturity of the project changes or the intent of the project changes.
I mean, if I'm writing, if what I'm writing is essentially a big string transform, like a compiler, right? A compiler is taking in a string of it's taking in some files and it's producing a binary. It's a big complicated string transform. It's probably not like it's not like a web server. It doesn't, the failure modes of a compiler are different from the failure modes of a web server. And so a team working on a compiler,
I see what you're saying.
A team working on a compiler has, they tolerate, they have, they've probably got some project infrastructure, and as long as people use that project infrastructure, they're avoiding certain kinds of problems, right? But then there's problems, in small corners of the code base, they may be doing things that a web server does, or like a web service does. They may be, calling out to HTTP this and that in some small corner, and so whereas a web service, it's HTTPing out all over the place. And so, in the second case, like everybody, when you're HTTPing out, we do it the same way, so that we get consistent, good results. In the compiler, every time you're working on a tree, we do it consistently in the same way. And so a well-functioning team will build a consensus over time on what are the practices that we do to avoid, the failure modes that are the highest risks to us. And, we leave it up to individuals and, spot reviews and spot tests to handle the small failure modes that, might cause problem in one part of the code, but that maybe are containable,
right?
That aren't threats to the whole, that aren't whole system threats, right? And when you're reviewing, you need to be reviewing in the context of, the norms that have emerged from the team, right?
I see.
And you're trying, because it's kind of doing similar things the same way is what allows us to have nice things like, shipping on time and taking vacations, that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But it also, this goes back to our, one of the points that we were talking about. It's not just sharing knowledge on how to do things, but how we do things here, right? Like, how we do things on this team, so that you can pick up somebody else's code, you can pick up a different module, and still expect to understand the conventions. Yeah,
and so maybe if I go into a new project, I may be seen as part of engineering leadership, despite only have been being there 3 months. But the onus is on me not to bring my baggage from past projects to the new team, right? Yeah, and like, there's not one true way to write, JavaScript, for example.
Right. All right. This is the same thing when you travel to a different country, right? Like, people do things differently, and I think it's a mistake to sort of. Of course, you bring those biases, but like to impose those biases, I think is where failure occurs.
And so that's what I mean by, and I think, a lot of the negative experiences, partly, there's egos. There's always egos.
I don't know what you mean, Mike.
But also there's these. Also there's, I think other negative experiences come from, people trying to be cops. No, it's like, like if you find yourself like, this doesn't look good to me, this is not acceptable to me, try to, step back and just say like, okay, I'm part of a team. Is this acceptable to the team? And if the answer is, I don't know, then, maybe find that out before writing a scathing, well, maybe phrase things nicely anyway. But,
I think that there's little reason to be scathing. In general, right? Like, fair enough. Mike, we're running short of time. I absolutely want to squeeze in a good thing, bad thing.
All right, hit me. So what is good thing, bad thing?
So every once in a while, you come across a thing and you're like, oh, that's a good thing. Oh, no, that's a bad thing.
Snap judgments, that's what I do.
That's right. You're here to judge. We're shooting for short, pithy answers so that we can wrap.
So I shouldn't nuance this like on one hand, on the other hand.
This does not require.
Okay.
All right, and then what I'm going to do is, of course, ask you, meaning of life type questions, and then expect you to summarize them in like.
All right. So yeah, I think giving decisive answers to things I know nothing about, that's definitely my wheelhouse. So shoot.
Dark mode, light mode in code review tools.
Yeah, I guess, medium, like, I don't care. Fine, go do what you want.
Do whatever you need to do.
Yeah.
I think a dark mode, light mode that takes the overall sentiment. takes the overall sentiment of the linter into account would be a fun one.
If I had to choose between that feature and maybe, like accessibility for visually impaired people, then I would definitely go with the accessibility fearture. But I mean, it probably is a matter of switching a style sheet somewhere.
You've chosen the one example which is like impossible to argue with. How about overarching style policies for a team?
Yeah, I think I think asking code reviewers to enforce style policies is a waste of everybody's time. But if you've got an automated tool, so bad thing if they're not automated. But if they increase scannability, like it's easier to come and just like visually look at code and kind of, get an idea of the overall structure because it's nicely formatted and consistent. I think they're a good thing. So automated good, yeah, human enforced one's bad.
How about tool enforced policies?
I think with
the emphasis on enforced.
Where the tool you mean when the IDE on save kind of auto formats things for you?
Correct.
I always find that a little bit unsettling, having my IDE change things for me, but yeah, I mean, I think they can be a big time saver, and I think having a you cannot commit this until like it kind of meets our automated policy is fine, as long as there's ways to do what you need to do within the policy, and the person who maintains the policy kind of is receptive to, yeah, like this is kind of being a big pain.
Yeah. The one example that we were violating our own rule around good thing, bad thing, but the one example that I remember, there's really good white space rules that people have, and that's fantastic. But essentially, what you're doing when you're writing a program is trying to convey meaning not just to the compiler, but also to another human being.
Yeah.
And sometimes, breaking the white space so that you can lay out code in a particular way.
Sometimes I want to be an artiste.
Exactly. Look at this thing. I've built this beautiful thing here.
Yeah, right? Everything, the function call, the function names all line up, the parentheses line up, and the arguments line up, and it's all column. I mean, I think, sometimes I want to be an artiste, but maybe the maintainer in the future isn't going to want to be it.
If it conveys meaning, maybe maybe a tool enforced lint policy. Maybe, but the consensus I'm reaching here is bad thing.
I think any tool, and if you want to enforce a policy before something gets reviewed to save reviewers from having to look at junk, that's one thing. If you say you must use this tool to achieve that end, I mean, like I don't see why you would, what that gains you. So
code reviews in interviews.
So this is kind of a hot topic, I guess.
I guess.
I think expecting an interviewee to draw a lot of conclusions about code that they haven't seen when they lack the context about the team's kind of needs and the team's coping strategies, I think is tough. I think if you go into the review, like anytime you're asking a question in an interview, you should have asked that question of your peers first,
right?
To see, and not just your peers, but people who don't have your team's particular context, right?
Right.
So if you do that, then I think you probably have reasonable expectations about what an interviewee should be able to do within 10-20 minutes. But if it's like, hey, I just cooked up with this code, look at it and tell me everything wrong with it, that doesn't seem like reasonable expectations.
All right, I'm concluding bad thing. SLAs on code review, like how long should I, like an expectation on how long before I need to get a response?
I mean, time zones permitting. I think a couple hours. I think teams tend to like I think there's strategies that you can do to, I think, like you commit a review and you're like, oh, I want to hear what people think about this so I can start building on this. You can always branch off it, right? And continue working. So I think there's things you can do to make good use of time, even if the review is blocking you. But it's really discourteous, not to get somebody kind of a high level, at least, this looks pretty good, or with some minor things.
I'll dig into the details, but like,
yeah, this looks pretty good, or I have a lot of concerns. Like, just just courtesy, just give people your high level take on it, within an hour or two, if you work in the same time zone.
Post commit code review.
I think they can, be fine. Like if the goal is information sharing, I haven't worked that way many places, but some things, like the team kind of has a general consensus, these are unlikely to be very very controversial. So, we'll review those post commit, and if the team starts noticing that there's an uptick in the ones that are controversial, then maybe you have a discussion, and hey, let's not do those things post commit. If everything is post commit, even like kind of things that people are gonna have a lot of discussion, then that seems silly. So I would rather branch and discuss things that are going to require input and some consensus building. But for many things, that's not the case.
Sounds going to be, this one is going to be hard to convey orally. So this is code revue, as in a song and dance about code.
So we have already established that I'm an artist, and I should not be an artist. And I did not honestly sign up to do this podcast, like with the expectation that I'd have to be creative or anything. So I'm going to say bad thing.
There is going to be a dance portion of this podcast.
Right.
Sounds really great, Mike. Fun as always talking to you, especially about code review. I think we touched on a whole bunch of different things on the purpose of code review, as a helping hand for programmers, on information sharing, on design. I think we touched a little bit on programming languages and their contributions, a whole bunch on things that code review tools do well and not. And if I remember right, we decided that Mike is doing a song and dance about code, maybe at the next podcast. Great as always talking to you, Mike.
Maybe before we inflict this on our audience, we should review it ourselves. So maybe pre-inflict podcast review is a thing. All right, great time.
I love this idea. Really great seeing you all. We'll see you same place next time. Catch you later.